Hey everybody, I'm Matt Karp, and I'm here talking to Paul Prescod, who has recently completed his race for the 8th District Senate seat in Pennsylvania. Paul was running against Anthony Hardy Williams, who is a 24-year veteran in this seat. Actually, his father served in this seat for 14 years before that, or 15 years before that. So we're talking 39-year dynasty that Paul was facing in this race, running on a left-wing Bernie Sanders-inspired program with a focus on jobs and education. Collected a surprising number of union endorsements for an insurgent progressive candidate. I'd like to talk about that later. Ultimately, in the election, Paul lost, got about 40% of the vote. And we're here today to talk about, in essence, the lessons we can learn from this race. Big underdog candidate going against an entrenched establishment figure. Some really impressive results and some disappointments too. So I wanted to begin, Paul, just by asking you, what is your sense of the lessons having run this? You've never been in political office before. You're a teacher, union activist. And this has been all new to you. What do you think went right? What went wrong? And what can we learn from this recent race in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, well, first, glad to be here. I'm glad we're having this conversation to debrief. So I'll start, I guess, with what went right before I go savage on myself and the campaign. I think just first of all, let's look at the results. So we won 40% of the vote overall in this race, so a total of 12,592 votes in the Philadelphia portion of the district. So my district is mostly Philadelphia, but significant segment of Delaware County. But if you just look at Philadelphia alone, we got 44% of the vote. And I think, I often get annoyed at the left. I think too often we try to spin defeats as victories, and, it's all about the friends we made along the way. So I don't want to try and do that. A defeat is a defeat. I did not receive a consolation prize for coming close in this race, but I do think this is a real achievement we can be proud of. This kind of result against an entrenched incumbent in a district, and I'll get into this later, a district that I think was particularly tough to run in as a progressive insurgent, first-time candidate. I think there's something we can really be proud of. So I think the broad coalition we formed was something that went really well, and I think was really powerful. Centered in labor, but not just labor. We got 11 labor union endorsements, including blue-collar unions like Teamsters 623, representing UPS workers, Postal Workers Union, AFSCME District Council 33, which is our blue-collar municipal workforce, so like sanitation workers, water department workers, as well as other groups like the Teachers Union. So this was a great labor coalition we built, and it was pretty rare for insurgents to get this labor support. I think, as a lot of the listeners know, I think you, Matt, certainly know this. There's a lot of factors mitigating against challengers getting this kind of support. I mean, often labor will just back the incumbent. I think the reason they didn't in this race is a few factors. I mean, one of them, I'll give myself credit. This is the result, I think, just years, really over a decade of work in the labor movement, building these deep relationships with these unions. They know clearly where I stand. They know labor is not just like one box I tick off on the platform for me. It's really central to my political identity. So I think that was a big part of it. Also, I think some timing was fortunate with just changes in the local labor movement. In a few of these unions, insurgent reformers won office in these unions right before this election. So these are people that I had a relationship with going back before they were in leadership. The incumbent did not. They knew me as someone that was behind them before they had the fancy title. So that, I think, played well as also, that timing of them assuming office at this time. I think under the old guard in some of these unions, I might not have gotten these endorsements. But the coalition was also beyond labor. We had, of course, the traditional left groups like DSA was a fundamental part of this campaign, Working Families Party, other groups like Free the Ballot, an organization working around mass incarceration, Fifth Square, which is kind of urbanist group in the city. So it was kind of a very unlikely coalition that people were surprised by. It composed many elements. So I think we did a really great job of having our platform anchored in a way that could build this broad level of support. And I think we had a terrific field game. This is a very large district geographically. We had a lot of volunteer power, I think more so than really any other race that was going on this cycle. And some of it was from labor, but often it wasn't, from groups like DSA, from just, regular people in my networks. And this really played out in some of the results, and we can digest more of this later. But, we won really big in the new areas of the district. So this, of course, was a census year. They redrew the maps. It did not change this district significantly, but we picked up more parts of South Philadelphia, for example. And, so this came down to, it wasn't necessarily just name recognition. My opponent hadn't been a state senator for decades in this district. So this came down to who had the better field game to reach these voters. And we really cleaned up in these new areas of the district in South Philadelphia. And that really spoke to just our dedicated volunteers. And we just had a much superior field game. And lastly, at least for now, for what I think went right, I think our messaging and platform was really strong. Honestly, I think this race, it came down to not people rejecting me because of feeling I was too radical or not liking the message. I think it came down to some other factors, which I'll get into later. But I think our platform really appealed to working people in this district. The platform is anchored in public investment, good jobs, public education, taxing the rich, and we spoke about it in very, just normal ways, very easy to understand ways that really appeal to people at the doors. It also, I think, was framed in a way that helped build this really broad and diverse coalition. So I think I really don't really have any regrets about our platform. Often we were at the doors. We would often start our conversations with an open-ended question of, what are some of the issues you care most about, you want to change, and often they would wind up saying one of the three platform points we had on our literature, which was not the extent of our platform, but the top three priorities, which were jobs and infrastructure, education, and gun violence. And often that was always the things people would name. So the platform, I think, was crafted in a good way, and the messaging was done in a way where people really understood it and it resonated.
Yeah. I mean, to me, the union stuff was one of the most inspiring features of the campaign, just from sort of an armchair view in Brooklyn. Familiar with I'd done some work with the Julia Salazar and Jabari Brisport campaigns in Brooklyn, state senate campaigns where progressive DSA endorsed socialist outsiders were running against either an incumbent or in an open seat. And neither one of them, had anything like your kind of blue collar union support. So in some ways, I mean, to shift gears though from the Pollyanna-ish narrative, which I think we can actually, we don't have to abandon entirely. I mean, you're running against the number 2 Democrat in Pennsylvania, a 50-year dynasty in this seat. I mean, if you think about Hardy Williams was in the state house since 1971. Sorry, I keep coming back to that, but it's really like, I mean, Nixon was president, in his first term, and there was a Hardy Williams representing some of these same areas of Southwest Philly. It's an unusually entrenched incumbent in that respect, regardless of, the performance of, the incumbent in the last couple of years. And he's the House Whip. It's a position of, significant power and patronage. So, we shouldn't underestimate, how high this mountain to climb was. And we can talk about the district too. I want to get into some of the demographics later. But yeah, I mean, I can't deny that I felt, from a distance kind of crushed on election night, because almost precisely because, you'd kind of, it seemed to me like you'd done everything right. You had, the sort of bread and butter, jobs, education, healthcare, violence program. You had the union endorsements, and not just the kind of the classic progressive unions, but sanitation workers, Teamsters, et cetera. And yet, the result, not just the win or the loss, but in terms of even, the votes that you won versus the votes that you didn't win, was really similar to other sorts of left-wing campaigns. So I guess, I mean, and we can get into some of that, sort of techno breakdown, but I guess I wanted to ask you, before we even get into that, like, the voters that you didn't win, you got about 12,500, right? And Williams ended up with about 18,000. What were they thinking, do you think, when they went in to vote and pulled that lever or filled in that circle?
Yeah, and this is where it's tough. There's a fine line between, I think we have to find the balance of acknowledging the structural factors, but also not letting that be a total excuse for not acknowledging what we did wrong. But I mean, I'll start. I do think there is a large element of a structural explanation here for for those voters, and obviously I can't get into all of their heads and what they were thinking, but I can say kind of anecdotally things that came up that kind of give a window into that. And I will just start with the first of all the impact of the sheer name recognition of someone that's been in office for that long, and their father being a very well liked figure, also extremely important for literally the development of the black political class in this city. So really deep roots there, and I think also just acknowledging that for a lot of for many black voters, especially loyal primary voting people, there is a loyalty still to the Democratic Party, to the machine, as you might want to call it, to the black political class. And that's a tough barrier to climb, not just for my, defeating my opponent, but you're also going against other elements of the local black political class who are, have endorsed this person and are pushing for him. And these are people that voters, for better or worse, do trust in many elements. So I think there's a story there of that is something that I don't think can just be overcome in one election cycle. I think we made a pretty good shot of it, but I think that's like a longer term project there of overcoming those loyalties that someone like me, yes, I'm known in some circles, but in many circles I wasn't. And I was having to become known and become trusted in this short window of time of this election cycle. So I think there's a factor there that really played into this. And so I think there's a certain issue of being rooted and certain relationships that weren't established. And I could say, even on election day itself, my day looked like going around to polls all across the city and a little bit in Delaware County, as people were voting and things like that. I ran into so many people, especially in the demographic of like older black voters, have been voting for this person forever. And some people they met me and they said, well, I'll vote for you next time. But it's like I've known Hardy Williams too long. He's been around forever. I don't really know you well. And there's a lot of people I met, not just on election day, but maybe in the last month of the campaign, where I thought, man, if I would have met these people in September, or I've had known them a few years, I think the outcome would have been different. There was a lot. People were very open to me. But I think there was just a lack of trust, just a lack of knowledge of who I am, what I'm about, just not really knowing where I'm coming from with this. So I think that is a large dynamic here. I also, if you look at the number breakdown in, Philadelphia, I think overall did very well. We got pretty badly beat in Delaware County. And I think that does speak to part of the challenges of this district, one of them being it geographically extremely large. The votes we won would have been enough for 2 state house seat races. But this was a state senate seat, very large, about a population of 250,000 people. Although, of course, majority of them are not voting in this primary. So, part of this was a deliberate choice. We had to focus resources in Philadelphia. We were in Delaware County, not as much as we should have been and could have been. But even if you look at it now, even if we would have won 50% of Delaware County, we still would have lost much narrowly, but we still would have lost the race overall, given how we did in Philly. So we knew we had to win big in Philly, and we focused a lot there. And part of that just speaks to a challenge of not being able to cover a district this large, especially when we're relying on volunteer power. So I'm convinced a lot of those people that voted for my opponent, if they would have known me, if they would have been introduced to us sooner, possibly would have had a different outcome. And I think another structural factor here that could have been going on in voters' heads was, and I wanted to avoid this, but I think in many ways this race was kind of played out as a proxy battle in this wider fight over gentrification and displacement, and this thought of me as an outsider, or only being aligned with gentrifiers, and the progressive left is just gentrifiers, and especially on certain specific fights that had taken place within the district. Some people just saw my race as a proxy for that larger fight, even though I don't think it should have been seen that way. One specific example, in South Philly, I met older black guy, very nice person. He mentioned he voted in South Philadelphia in my district. He voted for a progressive state rep last time around and felt he was burned on a certain local development issue that related to gentrification. And he just made it pretty clear. He basically saw me as being the same person that would implement that same kind of policy if he voted for me. So he felt he voted progressive once, he got burned, and he wasn't going to do that again. And again, in the context of me just meeting this person over the course of the election, I wasn't able to convince him in that moment that it would be different. If we had a relationship going back 4 or 5 years, maybe the outcome could have been different. So I think all these elements kind of played into, I think, walking in on election day, what voters decided to do. And finally, I think we shouldn't overestimate how a lot of these elections come down to very mundane things. So my opponent was backed by the local Democratic Party. Part of what that means is on election day, you walk into the booth, you are handed a slip, a sample ballot of what the party is recommending you vote for. Now, we covered many polling locations where we also were able to give people my literature, but many people walked into that booth trusting the local Democratic Party, trusting the local black political class, and they look at that sheet and that is telling them who they should vote for. So we shouldn't underestimate how much of it came down to a very simple thing like that is kind of hard to overcome.
Yeah, that's really helpful. To look into the to just both zoom out and zoom in here a little bit on the demographics of this race and this larger problem I think that's faced progressive and socialist challengers in politics in the last 6 years or so. The map of the district, right? So, Paul, you can speak with more specificity on this, but the quick gloss, looking at neighborhood numbers and then even some of the ward results, in the district is large and diverse, but in the area where you did best, essentially was University City around University of Pennsylvania, with a lot of younger, and then sort of following Baltimore Avenue out into West Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. Again, this is, an area where not to be stereotypical, but yeah, there's gentrification. This is where Dr. Dog is from, indie rock. This is I lived on 44th and Pine for 3 years when I was a graduate student. It's a mixed neighborhood for sure. And it's, it was then and it still is. But, in neighborhoods like that and then along Baltimore Avenue where, the new, brew pub and, all that stuff. My Philly knowledge is 10 years out of date, so nothing's new anymore. But anyway, that the general character of that neighborhood, you won, 66% are at. And then, which matches with, the numbers that, Julia Salazar would have put up in Williamsburg or Jabari Brisport put up in, parts of, I guess parts of Fort Greene where, similar sort of demographics, younger, more diverse, in the sense of, both class and race diverse. But easily glossed as gentrifying neighborhoods. And then, if you break it into three categories, and then there was sort of another, then in Point Breeze, right in South Philly, the new parts of the district you talked about, it looked like there the vote was about split. So you made some inroads, but even there, if you look at those micro wards, right, you kind of won the eastern part, and the western part kind of went more Hardy Williams, and it kind of followed that line of gentrification. And then if you go, the heart of the district, or not the heart, but the largest part of the district, out in Cobb's Creek and in Southwest Philly, which are 90% black and very working class. Williams won 75% or so of the vote, or even a little bit more. So anyway, so that's just, and that again tracks with how, Salazar or Brisport performed. So this is at once reflected the specificity of this race in this district, and, no doubt Williams's, entrenched incumbency and dynastic character and the local Democratic Party and the machine. But in other ways, it sort of actually is the same map as, if you look at Cori Bush's race in St. Louis, it's the same thing. It's these progressives, coming in from the left, who have the kind of ostensibly, redistributive platform. I mean, it worked in to some extent, not in every area. Bernie's numbers were a little bit skewed both in 16 and 20. It's a bit more complex because Bernie actually did win some of the most sort of working class parts of, for instance, Los Angeles, with Latino voters. But in general, progressive candidates in in cities have struggled to win, in a sense, the urban working class, especially the black urban working class. And, that is a kind of almost, I don't want to say it's a universal law, but it seems to transcend the specificity of these races. So, and in fairness, and I'd be interested in your take on this. It's not exactly clear that since 2016, left-wing candidates have done much better with white working class voters either. In some ways, it's Bernie and Latinos were like the sort of the one exception to this general rule, which really is almost more of a class rule than a race rule. Although, because a lot of these candidates do have strength in cities, in some ways, it's sort of the black working class that represents the sort of the toughest nut to crack for a lot of these state houses. Left-wing candidates aren't even on the map in a lot of overwhelmingly white working class districts. So that would be my argument, that this is still primarily a class issue rather than strictly a race issue. But clearly race plays a part in it. Your candidate mobilized race to some extent. Your opponent mobilized race to some extent. So I'd be really interested in hearing both your take on the specific and the general in this larger challenge for, the future of the Bernie left, which really, is struggling to kind of bring into reality its vision of class politics, on the ground.
Yeah, and I think I'll start by saying, and again, I always want to be, I'm definitely leaning very hard towards the structural barriers here for this one race, and I don't want to overstate that or take away from stuff we could have done better. But, one way I'm thinking about this, and I remember this coming up after Bernie, not to compare my race really to Bernie in many respects is really not comparable. But
I mean, you certainly won more votes in the 8th than Bernie did.
That's true. Hey,
yeah,
there you go.
Take it. Yeah.
So, but I remember this, all the agonizing after both, I think 2016, especially 2020, the wager was, can he mobilize people who normally don't vote to vote this time? And he didn't. And I think really the answer to that for me has always been, that is a project that is more like decades in the making than one electoral cycle to overcome, the fact that working people, their voter participation has been going down so much over, decades. I don't think that's something that you can be the best candidate in the world, the best campaign to do that in one electoral cycle. And I think similarly in this race, I think ultimately this project of, winning over more working class black voters to progressive candidates and campaigns just cannot be done in one single electoral cycle. And I think, and I hope this doesn't sound too pathetic or grasping at straws, but I do think there was some significance in that in those areas where we did get beaten very badly, we were getting 25%, 30%, and not 5 to 10%. I think there is something there to build on. And and one challenge in this relates to labor in both a positive and negative way. So, we got a lot of union endorsements, and actually happened to be the unions that were the most black membership in the city. And I can testify to, in areas in Southwest Philadelphia, on a number of occasions, people walking into the voting booth with their, Ask Me DC 33 sample ballot, saying like, oh yeah, I saw you on the sample ballot. I'm voting for you because of my union. So that's good. But having said that, a lot of these unions did not necessarily have an aggressive field program electorally. And this kind of speaks to a broader challenge of, the weakness of the labor movement overall, which translates into how much they can do for their own members and how much they can fight for strong contracts, I think also translates into electoral realm. If you're struggling to defend your own members, you're probably also going to struggle to have a robust electoral program to get the candidates that you want. And, to go back to some very specific things in this race, I don't know if this would have changed the whole outcome or not. But, in particular, there are two unions that I think have the best electoral field programs in this city. They decided to stay neutral in this race, and the reason is because one of their key allies on city council was also backing my opponent pretty heavily, and they did not want to damage that relationship. We can debate whether that was a good decision or not, but that is the reality of why they stayed neutral, and that meant, two unions that did have really great field programs were not being able to get involved on my side in this race. So there's always those very specific elements in each race you got to look at that could determine the outcome. But, overall, labor, I think, did what it could, but there were limits to what it could do in this race. And I think if they, would have had, all of them had this like really big, robust field program, I think we would have been able to make more inroads with Black working class voters. But again, I think the results show that we could be onto something here. And I think if we are persistent in building these ties, and continuing to wage not just electoral campaigns, but issue-based campaigns that really matter to people in these areas and build deeper connections with these unions, I think we're onto something for the future. But you're right. I mean, we weren't able to buck the trend for progressives overall, which I think kind of does show that it's not purely about each candidate and whether they're good or bad or how much they did or didn't do, but I think it speaks to the nature of this longer term project and process that we need to engage in, and we're not going to, we're not going to figure out how to circumvent the Black political class that's been entrenched for so long. We're not going to do that overnight. We're not going to do that in one electoral cycle, but I think there's certain lessons we can learn from this race, and I think we made a good start on that road.
Yeah, I was just looking back at some of Bernie's results, say in the third ward out in Cobbs Creek, and he was at 8-9%. So Prescod coming in with 21%. That's hey, that's nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, again, and I really hope it's not too pathetic, but in some of those areas it was like 25%. I think maybe in concessing areas like 30%, and again, I think there's a big difference there between that and 5 to 10%, and I think the process we can start. And again, it was maddening to hear this on election day, but I cannot tell you how many, disproportionately older Black voters who literally told me like, yeah, I like you. I'll vote for you next time. And even people who agreed with me that they weren't satisfied with the incumbent saying like, I'm going to vote for him this time, but I like you. You should keep at it. I think I would vote for you next time. And that's frustrating, but I think it shows potential in a protracted way.
I mean, yeah, the question is, that points to a relatively simple diagnosis in some ways, which is just, if the question is, about time and trust, then, and familiarity, then, it's actually really vital that, on that theory that, left-wing candidates go out and lose elections in a way that builds goodwill. Obviously, there's a way to lose an election that, achieves the opposite. Yeah. Clearly, based on your results, this was not the case in yours. But that, thinking about this loss itself, maybe this is, almost too obvious to say, but as a building block on a potential victory, because if you were to run again in 4 years, or if you were to run for another race, or if if we're thinking about a transformation of Philadelphia or Pennsylvania politics over 5, 10, an extended struggle.
Yeah, and there's a simple fact. I don't know if this is an exact saying or not, but the cliche of like how much politics comes down to relationships, and it really is true. I mean, and I'll just give two anecdotes that kind of show the potential for the future. Both people I met throughout the course of the campaign. One of them on election day itself, and how we're continuing this relationship. So one of them who works with a rec center in South Philly, in kind of a more working class Black area of the district. Now, this person was a supporter of mine, but we're working now to collaborate, working with the Teamsters on union job programs for youth in the future. So that's something we're going to keep doing. That's a relationship will continue to be built. The other one, this is a more interesting anecdote. On election day itself, I towards the end of the day, I guess an hour before polls closed, I went to the voting area of my opponent, actually literally his voting place.
Where is that?
In Cobbs Creek in Southwest Philadelphia. So I went there towards the end. It's a school. I'm chatting with the committee people who were handing out his sample ballots. I meet this woman who, literally said, it's like, well, I already voted for Williams, but like, I feel like if I would have met you before, I would have supported you. We had a good conversation. She just followed up with me literally today. I'm waiting on a call. She asked me to testify at the city council hearing about the closure of pools and rec centers in Southwest Philadelphia. We're probably going to keep working together in the future. And this, again, I wish I would have met these people a year ago, but that's the other thing with these campaigns. They are, in a way, an excuse to meet so many people you wouldn't have met otherwise. And there was also a frustrating part of the campaign. Often a critique was literally kind of amounted to, why haven't you already been a state senator for 24 years? Like, how come I didn't meet you before? Well, it's like, well, look, if I'm a teacher, I'm not going to randomly.
You got to start somewhere.
Yeah, I'm not going to randomly show up to meetings to the other side of the city if I'm just a teacher and not already thinking of running for office. But over the course of this campaign now, I've met so many more people, so many more relationships that are outside of like the left bubble to keep building on. So
You got to go
I
to
think
the
it's
meetings
about
now,
losing.
Paul.
What's that?
You got to go to the meetings now.
I know, right? Yeah, like
Yeah, now you got a lot of
so.
meetings in your future.
Right. And again, whether it's me running or it's someone else, but I think there's like a good way to lose and a bad way to lose. If I would have gotten 10% overall, I don't know if I could sit here and say there's like
Yeah.
good prospects for the future, but I think we lost in a way that where it's okay, we're onto something. I think if we keep at it, we can actually make some inroads in these areas the left hasn't been able to before.
Yeah, they say that old chestnut socialism is too many meetings. Well, so's insurgent democracy.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to give a two-headed provocation here on or an argument that maybe refutes itself about running a campaign in this kind of district. One would be, just building on some of the things that you'd said about, where, you're canvassing, facing limited resources, in a very large district, where your canvassing operations centered on, right? And it's centered on, as we look at the map, a lot of the districts that you did well. Some of that was, clearly about how many doors you knocked, how many voters you contacted, et cetera. Some of it was also clearly about, the kind of voters that may be more receptive for whatever reason to an insurgent or outsider campaign. And so, you critique would be, which I'll partly refute and see what you, but I'm more interested in hearing what you think, would be, okay, well, why didn't you say, okay, we're going to win University City. Let's canvass the hell out of Cobb's Creek. Let's take this fight right to the toughest turf, because those are the doors we got to knock. Now, my own skeptical response to that, it's still worth, I think, having this debate. But like, my own skeptical response is, this just, if our analysis about time and trust being crucial, then the idea that, you're not knocking the right doors, what would a bunch of Prescod canvassers, roaming around, 61st Street, what good would it do if there's no basis of, there are no relationships there? So, but then again, that leads you back to the same position where you're, building those relationships in the places where, maybe you're already going to win. So it's a bit of a, it's a bit of a catch-22, or I wonder, that's often how it strikes me. I wonder if you have, different thoughts about that kind of, in essence, tactics about how to approach these districts. I mean, maybe, I did hear, talking to some volunteers, it's like, I wish, honestly, just to be, to put it in racial terms, because, as the man once said, race is the mode in which classes lived. We didn't have enough black canvassers, to basically, like, another way to put it, maybe we didn't have enough canvassers from, who hailed from those neighborhoods. All our canvassers were from, Center City, or were from University City, or were from outside the district. I don't know if it's about race or about geography, but, is there a sense of, like, how to tactically, in the course of a campaign, meet this? I know what we've just said is all to the point that, you can't do it in one cycle. And I agree with that, but I'm just interested in where you come down on some of these debates. You must have had these conversations during the campaign.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing I'll say is we actually did canvass a lot. I don't have the exact numbers. I don't have that spreadsheet in front of me, but in terms of like Southwest Philadelphia, Cobb's Creek, we canvassed there a lot, generally. So I don't think it was even though we knew we probably wouldn't win those areas like we're going to win other areas. We canvassed there a lot. So I wouldn't say we necessarily like ignored that part. Okay. I would say in Delaware County, that was a weakness. We definitely were not out there as much as we could have and it should have been. So, generally I would say, yes, even when I started canvassing on my own, before I even had much of a staff, I actually deliberately started out in the 40th Ward, Southwest Philadelphia, because I figured, this is where I got to start making inroads as soon as possible. And again, broadly speaking, even early on, we were out there. So I think that point is that, like, generally well taken. And this is where I'll kind of go back to the union question, because and I think it did matter. I mean, this question of race and what does your coalition appear to be like? Because the reality is that who we had out canvassing in the field was not a true picture of the full breadth of what the coalition was. And part of my wager from the very beginning is, like, needing to get the unions that endorsed to really be involved in the field. Because again, the unions we had were actually disproportionately Black and brown membership, in the city. But again, we were not able to get to a point where those unions had a great field program where they were getting members out regularly to canvas. And that was one of our wagers I think we had to depend on, because, the reality is we were relying on a subset of very hyperactive people politically, disproportionately DSA, disproportionately these left groups that
freaks
are already,
like me. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and again, this is just like a structural challenge. I mean, disproportionately white people in these groups, and I think that does have an effect. I think the average voter, again, I don't think it came down to, oh my God, a white person's knocking on my doors, I can't support you. But there's an element there, and it also fed into my opponent's attacks of like, see, gentrifier candidate, outsider. So, and again, we were kind of wagering that maybe the labor involvement could help mitigate against that, and it couldn't. And I'll throw this out there, something I learned more about just how it works, and this is another structural disadvantage. These establishment candidates, what they're able to do is have a lot of paid canvassers, and they can do that by, they'll go into these communities and be able to offer, jobs to people locally to canvas, and it gives them, I think, a one up to be able to see, look, I have quote unquote the community with me, where it's like, well, yeah, you're able to pay people, and we can't really do that, where we're kind of relying more on volunteers. But that's something that, we have to contend with, that it's not really working in our favor. And one other thing I'll put out, I think that hurt us with COVID, we did do, I think, considerable outreach to, local churches, senior centers, which are big. I mean, think about who's disproportionately voting in large numbers in these primaries. We did run into a barrier where during COVID, especially during Omicron variant, a lot of these senior centers shut down, and we couldn't have access to them. A lot of these churches were not doing services in person where we could go and get a large audience. Even though we had tried, I think we could have tried harder and earlier in the cycle to do outreach to these kinds of institutions. But COVID, I think, had an effect where, without that, I think we would have had certain access and certain exposure that we didn't otherwise. But I think the point is well taken, that I think the earlier we could have tried to engage in these areas we knew we were already weaker, the better. And I think the better chance we'd have of finding people from these areas that could then be turned into volunteers on this campaign. But, this is where I think labor was key. I don't think we got exactly the level of engagement we wanted to, in terms of what it looked like out on the doors from labor. But it's definitely something we got to think about in the future.
Yeah, I mean, maybe those other unions would have given you that, would have helped you get over the hump in that way. The unions that stayed neutral. But it's interesting, just to maybe to take it in one final direction. We've had a sort of a rich tactical conversation here about, this problem of, almost premised on the idea that this problem of, if you will, class de-alignment within left-wing politics, which is a real problem. I think one of the major problems facing not just the Democrats, I've written a lot about this, but actually facing the left, facing, the sort of squad-style post-Bernie politics. It was a problem for Bernie 2020. It's a problem for, progressives everywhere. This is a lot of the reason why, Jacobin's getting involved with, the Center for Working Class Politics, trying to figure out to what extent this problem can be, approached politically. But I guess I wanted to ask you that. I mean, the assumption in some ways almost unstated here in this conversation is that, this is not, in a sense, a messaging or a politics problem. This is a familiarity, a relationships, a networks, a trust, a structural, institutional problem, maybe can be mitigated by various tactics or various contingencies here or there. But I guess I wanted to just throw the argument at you, either to refute or to play with. I mean, is there a political problem with elements of a progressive message in playing in Kinsessing or Cobb's Creek? Is there, to what extent, I mean, not so much necessarily your campaign, but, your campaign being, as you said, taking part within a larger fight in Philadelphia and elsewhere, a larger conversation about, left-wing outsiders versus establishment insiders. There is an argument that a lot of these working class voters, black and non-black, are actually, either conservative or in effect moderate on a number of these questions, whether they be cultural or even economic. And that, the prospect of Bernie style like change is actually just not as appealing to them as we might like to think in our kind of folk theory of populist politics. So I just love to hear your thoughts on that question about literally the substance of the campaign, and then on top of that, the style and the messaging of the campaign, which is really inextricable. And if there are lessons you had on that front going forward.
Yeah, and you read my mind, because I was going to get to where I think the messaging really did matter in this race. And so I think positive takeaways from this race, a lot I think was proven to show that I think we're on the right track, at least in terms of what we talk about at Jacobin, the Center for Working Class Studies. Because I'll tell you very clearly, what I found on the doors was the platform elements about taxing the rich, about union jobs, trade schools. The most enthusiasm for that was among black voters. I can say, anecdotally, just on the doors, at events, community events I went to, those are the parts that had the most enthusiasm, especially among black voters. Even when handing someone my literature and they look at it, when they turn it over, seeing the union endorsements, it was more so often black voters who looked at that very positively, and said that was a really good thing. And when I talked about trade schools, that really resonated with folks. I think that kind of stuff showed that actually these elements of the Bernie style platform are extremely popular across the board, even with working class black voters. And the other side of that, too, is where I think the messaging mattered was, overwhelmingly, it wasn't even a close contest. Gun violence was the number one issue. No contest. And I think, if I would have been someone who was associated with defunding the police or something like that, maybe those areas I got 25%, I would have gotten 2%. You know what I mean? And I think it was a strength of our campaign that my opponent was not able to paint us as, oh my God, they're just like these crazy radicals who, don't care about crime.
Did he try that?
He really did not. Now, what I don't know, this is where I can't get into everyone's heads. Like, I don't know if there was enough of an association among people of like, well, he's still like all those progressives and like it's still basically the same thing. I don't know that, but I think our campaign did a good job of saying like we're taking violent crime really seriously. I think the people at least we talked to and we got that message from us, and like we were able to couch it in as this is an issue of public investment, of schools, of jobs. But it was very clear to me from this campaign that we have to acknowledge this crisis of violent crime. We have to, I think, acknowledge the nuance in this and like come with some credible solutions that I think that are centered around public investment. But I think that was a huge takeaway that, if we would have ran a campaign that ignored violent crime or had solutions that were just totally out of step of what working people wanted, I think we would have gotten results that were way, way worse than what we did get. And I think this has kind of just validated a lot of what we've been talking about on Jacobin or in these kinds of circles for a while. And again, I think the takeaway overall should be a positive one of, we lost this one. We came pretty close. Again, if you look at Philadelphia specifically, 44%, we came pretty close. And I think most encouragingly is our platform really resonated with all kinds of people. I think this race came down to not a rejection of our platform. I think it was a rejection of just an unknown, not enough of a rootedness, not enough of relationships. But I think the platform itself went over very well. And I think other candidates should kind of seek to kind of model the way we did it. Not just the substance, but I think the style of speaking about it in very simple terms, in very concrete ways that I think make it very hard for an opponent to paint us as out of step with what average voters would want.
Yeah, one proof of that, right, is in the pudding, is in the extent to which Williams didn't make an ideological challenge to your campaign, really. It was almost, entirely on the grounds of, a certain kind of identity, a certain kind of, insider-outsider, positioning, right. Rather than, this policy is crazy or, my opponent wants to do X and Y and I want to do Z and Q, which is far superior. Like, that's not the issue. That is the specifics of this dilemma facing left-wing candidates often in, deep blue districts where, the establishment candidates, ideologically, at least in terms of their literature or the things they talk about, can often make them sound, they can mimic whatever rhetoric, progressives are offering on a meta level, and not really tie themselves to the mast in any substantive way to a progressive platform, but can kind of speak that same language and kind of neutralize, any ideological advantage, and then, conduct the campaign entirely on know-how and experience.
And I think the messaging, I can't prove this for certain, but I think it helped even with the union support. And I think it can help other candidates too, because, I think in my situation, I think a lot of it was relationship based. And also just proving early enough that you are a serious candidate, you can raise money, that all factors into it. But I think part of it too is like, yes, I'm a DSA person, DSA candidate. I did not have to shy away from that, to get union support. But also, I think if it's a choice between your rhetoric, is it going to be socialism, or union jobs, what do you center? I think it helps to be very focused on, this candidate is always talking about jobs. He's always talking about unions. I think that helps make it safer for them to feel I can endorse this person, as opposed to, well, this is just an insurgent radical. I don't really know where jobs fits into their standpoint. I think that kind of what you choose to focus in your rhetoric. I mean, I kind of took a page out of Bernie's book. I think he handled it very well, whereas he didn't run from the socialist label. He couldn't, even if he wanted to. But at the end of the day, he did not need to start every sentence with "as a socialist." It was very clear platform-wise what he stood for. He did not have to, get into labels over and over again to show that.
Yeah. Well, Paul, see you again in 2026. Is that the plan?
The answer is I don't know. Just so everyone knows. So
what do you want to tell people what you're up to next?
Yeah, well, I'm going to be starting working for Teamsters for a Democratic Union soon, which I'm excited about. Rank and file network inside the Teamsters. This is a really exciting moment. We have a new reform leadership that's been elected nationally. The UPS contract expires in July of 2023. So I think we're looking at a possible big confrontation there with UPS, the largest private sector employer in the United States. So I'm going to be working with them back at home. Screw this electoral crap. Back in labor, where I think I'm most at home.
Yeah. I mean, and see how this purported labor insurgency of 2022, that would be a sort of a macro test of where we're going on that front, in terms of the wave of unionizations and insurgent labor, across the country. That contract is going to be one to keep an eye on.
Yeah. And a lot of opportunity for broader solidarity among the left, among, community organizations. I think we can turn that into a real, not just a UPS fight, but like a class-wide, this is about the future of jobs in this country.
Yeah, no, totally. And I mean, it's another version of this same struggle where, this is a topic for another conversation, but like, sometimes I worry that, both on the if you think about, the Bernie-ish left project as having the, two big wings, the electoral and the labor wing. And, on both fronts, we've had a lot more success than the left ever had in some ways in, the previous 10 years. So, pat ourselves on the back. In other ways, even some of the success that we've had, I worry on both those fronts, risks this problem of kind of ghettoization and winning the areas that, for various structural reasons, also suggest that you can't actually win the areas you need to win to make transformative change. That you win this district that's demographically friendly, you organize this shop that's already all set up for you, and winning some of those fights, some of those big fish fights on more difficult terrain. I think that is going to be the challenge of the next 10 years to see where if on either front, the left can kind of escape its own cul-de-sac in some ways.
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
All right. So on that ambivalent note, it's hard to wrap it up in any other feeling these days. But thanks for your race, Paul. I want to thank you. I had a chance to see you when you came to New York and speak about the race, and I followed it from a distance. Supported a little bit, monetarily, but really, I didn't lift a finger for you. I should have done more.
But you lifted that finger to act blue. That's
Yeah,
that's a lot.
absolutely. But I think I'm not. I know I don't speak just for myself to thank you on behalf of all of your supporters, both inside and outside your district. And I think there is a lot of hope that the Prescod machine continues into the 2020s.
Hey, we'll see. But yeah, for now, I'm just glad to get some sleep. So I'll take it from there.
All right, enjoy it, Paul.
All
Thanks,
right. Thanks, man.
thanks for chatting.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.